There are ships that sink, ships that burn, ships that are swallowed by storms and disappear beneath the waves, taking their crews with them into the deep. And then there are ships that simply stop. Ships found sailing perfectly, sails set, cargo intact, food on the table. Ships where everything is in its place except the one thing that matters most, the people. On December 5th, 1872, a British merchant vessel spotted such a ship drifting in the Atlantic Ocean. When they boarded her, they found a scene that would become one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history. The ship was seaworthy. The cargo was untouched. There was 6 months' worth of food and water aboard, but there was not a single soul to be found. 10 people had been on board when the ship left New York Harbor. The captain, his wife, his 2-year-old daughter, and 7 crew members. All of them had vanished. This is the story of the Mary Celeste. This is the mystery of the ghost ship. Sleep if you can. Part 1. The Cursed Ship. Before we talk about what happened in 1872, we need to understand that the Mary Celeste had a history, and that history was not kind. The ship was built in 1861 at Joshua Dewis's shipyard in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, on the shores of the Bay of Fundy. She was constructed of locally felled timber, carvel built with the hull planking flush rather than overlapping. She was rigged as a 2-masted brigantine, a type of vessel designed for both cargo capacity and reasonable speed. Her original name was Amazon. The Amazon was launched under British registration in May 1861. She was 103 feet long, with a breadth of about 26 feet. Not a large ship by any standard, but sturdy and well built. Her first captain was Captain Robert McClellan. He didn't last long. On the ship's maiden voyage in June 1861, McClellan became suddenly and mysteriously ill. Within days he was dead. The cause was never clearly determined. Command passed to John Nutting Parker, who took the Amazon across the Atlantic to London. On the return voyage, while crossing the English Channel, the Amazon collided with another ship, a fishing brig, which sank as a result. The Amazon was damaged but survived. In 1863, while crossing the Atlantic again, the ship encountered a severe storm and was forced to put into port in France for repairs. The cost of repairs was more than the ship's owners wanted to pay. The Amazon changed hands. Over the next few years, the ship passed through several owners, none of whom seemed able to make a profit with her. She developed a reputation. Sailors whispered that she was unlucky, that she was cursed. In October 1867, the Amazon ran aground on the shore of Cape Breton Island during a storm. The damage was severe enough that her owners declared her a wreck and sold her for salvage. She was purchased by Alexander McBean as abandoned property, repaired and sold again to Richard W. Haynes of New York. It was Haynes who gave her a new name, Mary Celeste. The name change didn't improve her luck. Haynes ran into financial difficulties and had debts he couldn't pay. In 1869, the ship was seized by creditors and sold at auction. She was purchased by a consortium headed by James H. Winchester, a shipping agent from New York. Over the next 3 years, the consortium's composition changed several times, with various investors buying and selling shares, but Winchester retained at least a half share throughout. In early 1872, the Mary Celeste underwent a major renovation. The work cost $10,000, a substantial sum at the time. Her length was increased to 103 feet, her breadth to 25.7 feet, and her depth to 16.2 feet. A second deck was added. The poop deck was extended. Many timbers were replaced. Her tonnage increased to 282 tons. She was, in essence, rebuilt, made new. Perhaps the owners thought this would break whatever curse had followed her from her days as the Amazon. It didn't. By October 1872, the consortium consisted of Winchester with 6 shares and 2 minor investors with 1 share apiece. The remaining 4 shares were held by the ship's new captain. His name was Benjamin Briggs, and he would be the last captain the Mary Celeste ever had. Part 2. The Captain. Benjamin Briggs was born on April 24, 1835 in Wareham, Massachusetts, to Captain Nathan Briggs and his wife Sophia. He came from a seafaring family. His father was a ship captain. His brothers became ship captains. The ocean was in his blood, as the saying goes. Benjamin began his career at sea as a young boy, first serving aboard vessels commanded by his father. He learned navigation, seamanship, the rhythms of the ocean, the language of wind and wave. By his early 20s, he had earned his master mariner's license. He was qualified to command his own vessel. On September 9th, 1862, at the age of 27, Benjamin married Sarah Elizabeth Cobb. She was the daughter of Reverend Leander Cobb, pastor of the Congregational Church in Marion, Massachusetts. By all accounts, it was a happy marriage. Sarah was educated, intelligent, and shared her husband's adventurous spirit. She would occasionally accompany him on his voyages, unusual for the time but not unheard of. They had 2 children, a son, Arthur Stanley Briggs, born in 1865, and a daughter, Sophia Matilda Briggs, born on October 31st, 1870. Benjamin Briggs was a respected captain. He had commanded several vessels over the years: the brigantine Seafoam, the schooner Forest King, and the bark Arthur. He had a reputation for competence, fairness, and integrity. He was also known for his religious faith. He was a devout Christian, a member of the Congregational Church, and he didn't drink alcohol, a notable trait in an era when many sailors were known for heavy drinking. Those who sailed with him described him as even-tempered, methodical, and careful, not given to rash decisions or unnecessary risks, the kind of captain you wanted when the weather turned bad. In 1871, Benjamin and his brother Oliver discussed leaving the sea entirely. They considered purchasing a hardware store in New Bedford and settling down to a life on land. But Benjamin couldn't quite give up the ocean. Not yet. Instead, in 1872, he invested his savings, $2,500, a substantial sum, to purchase a partial stake in a ship. He became part owner of the Mary Celeste, holding 4 of the 12 shares. This meant he had a financial interest in the ship's success. It wasn't just a job for him, it was an investment in his family's future. In October 1872, Winchester offered Briggs command of the Mary Celeste for her first voyage following the extensive renovation. The ship would carry a cargo of industrial alcohol from New York to Genoa, Italy. Briggs accepted. He made a decision that would seal his fate. He invited his wife and younger daughter to accompany him on the voyage. Sarah and little Sophia would sail with him to Italy. It would be an adventure for them, and the accommodations had been modified to be suitable for a family. Their son Arthur, who was 7 years old and needed to attend school, would stay behind with his grandmother at Rose Cottage in Marion, Massachusetts. Briggs began assembling his crew with the same care he applied to everything. He wanted experienced, reliable men he could trust. He chose Albert G. Richardson, aged 28, as first mate. Richardson was married to a niece of James Winchester, the ship's primary owner. He had sailed under Briggs before and was known to be competent. Andrew Gilling, aged about 25, as second mate, born in New York of Danish extraction, experienced and capable. Edward William Head, aged 23, as steward and cook, newly married with a personal recommendation from Winchester himself. And 4 general seamen, all Germans from the Frisian Islands: Volkert Lorenzen, aged 29, Bos Lorenzen, Volkert's younger brother, sometimes listed as Boy Lorenzen, aged 23, Arian Martens, aged 35, Gottlieb Gutschall, aged 23. A later testimonial would describe these 4 as peaceable and first-class sailors. This was Briggs's crew, 7 men plus himself, his wife, and his daughter, 10 souls in total. On October 20th, 1872, Captain Briggs arrived at Pier 50 on the East River in New York City to supervise the loading of the Mary Celeste's cargo. The cargo consisted of 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, industrial alcohol, not fit for drinking. It was being shipped by H. Mascarena's company to a firm in Genoa, where it would be used to fortify Italian wines. The barrels were loaded carefully into the hold. Each barrel was marked and registered. The total value of the cargo was approximately $37,000, a significant sum in 1872. Sarah and Sophia joined Benjamin a week later, settling into the modified cabin that would be their home for the voyage across the Atlantic. On November 3, 1872, Benjamin wrote a letter to his mother. "It seems real home-like since Sarah and Sophia got here, and we enjoy our little quarters. Hoping to be with you again early in the spring with best love to all." He mentioned that the ship was in beautiful trim and that he hoped for a fine passage. Everything was ready. On Tuesday morning, November the 5th, 1872, the Mary Celeste cast off from Pier 50 and moved into New York Harbor. But the weather looked uncertain. Captain Briggs, cautious as always, decided to wait for better conditions before heading out to sea. He anchored the ship just off Staten Island. Sarah used the delay to send one final letter to her mother-in-law. She wrote about the crew. They seemed to be very good men. She added in what would be her last written words, "If they continue as they have begun, I shall have nothing to fear from them." On Thursday, November 7th, 1872, the weather improved. At around 8 in the morning, Captain Benjamin Briggs gave the order to weigh anchor. The Mary Celeste set sail for Genoa. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. Part 3. The Voyage. To understand what happened next, we need to follow another ship. A ship whose path would intersect with the Mary Celeste in a way that would make history. The DEI Gracia was a Canadian brigantine, similar in size and type to the Mary Celeste. She was captained by David Reed Morehouse, an experienced sailor from Nova Scotia. Morehouse and Benjamin Briggs knew each other. They weren't close friends, but they moved in the same maritime circles. In fact, just a day before the Mary Celeste sailed, Morehouse had dined with the Briggs family in New York. Briggs had spoken about his planned voyage to Genoa. He'd mentioned how pleased he was with his crew and how he was looking forward to having Sarah and Sophia aboard. Morehouse's ship, the DEI Gracia, was also loading cargo in New York in early November. She would be carrying a load of petroleum to Gibraltar. On November 15th, 1872, 8 days after the Mary Celeste had departed, the DEI Gracia left New York Harbor and headed east across the Atlantic. Both ships were following similar routes, both heading generally toward the Mediterranean, but the Mary Celeste had a week's head start. Meanwhile, aboard the Mary Celeste, the voyage was not going smoothly. Captain Briggs kept a log, a daily record of the ship's position, the weather conditions, the state of the vessel, and any notable events. The log was written in a clear, methodical hand. Briggs's training and careful nature showed in every entry. From the log and from later analysis, we know that the Mary Celeste encountered rough weather almost immediately after leaving New York. Heavy seas, strong winds, not unprecedented for November in the North Atlantic, but challenging. The ship made slow progress. On some days the headwinds were so strong that she barely advanced at all. November 10th, rough seas, wind from the northwest. November 12th, weather improving slightly but still slow going. November 15th, position recorded making steady if unspectacular progress. November 20th, more storms, heavy weather. November 24th, the log notes that they were approaching the Azores, a group of islands in the mid-Atlantic, about 900 miles west of Portugal. November 25th, 1872, 8 a.m., the last entry in the log. It read, "At 5 p.m. made the island of St. Mary's, Santa Maria, one of the Azores Islands, bearing east-southeast. At 8 a.m., the eastern point bore SSW 6 miles distant." The entry was routine. It indicated their position about 6 nautical miles from Santa Maria Island. Weather conditions were noted. Everything seemed normal. And then, nothing. No more entries in the log, no explanation, no indication that anything was wrong. There was something else, something found later. On a slate, a temporary writing surface that sailors used to record data before transferring it to the official log, there was a note. It read, November 25th, 8 o'clock. Fanny, my dear wife, Francis Mr. Richardson. This was written by Albert Richardson, the first mate. The Fanny he referred to was his wife, Frances. It was a personal note, perhaps intended for a letter home, or perhaps just an idle scribbling during a quiet watch. But it was dated November 25th at 8 o'clock, the same time as the last log entry. After this, there is no more contemporary record of what happened aboard the Mary Celeste. The ship continued to sail. The wind filled her sails. The Atlantic carried her eastward. But at some point between November 25th and December 4th, everyone aboard abandoned the ship. Why? When? Under what circumstances? No one knows, because no one who was there ever told the story. Part 4. The Discovery. December 4th, 1872. Early afternoon. The Dei Gratia was about 400 miles east of the Azores, sailing toward Gibraltar. The weather had improved. The seas were relatively calm. At approximately 1 p.m., one of the crew members spotted a ship in the distance. Captain Morehouse examined the vessel through his spyglass. It was a brigantine sailing under partial sail, but something about its movement seemed wrong. The ship was yawing, drifting from side to side, not holding a steady course. Morehouse watched the ship for about 2 hours, trying to determine if anyone was aboard, if there were any signals being sent, any indication of what might be wrong. He saw nothing, no movement on deck, no response to his presence. Finally, he made a decision. He would send a boarding party to investigate. He called for Oliver Devoe, his chief mate, and John Wright, the second mate. Along with a seaman named John Johnson, they lowered a boat and rowed across the gap between the two ships. As they drew closer, they could see the name on the vessel's stern, Mary Celeste. Morehouse felt a chill. He knew that ship. He knew her captain. He'd had dinner with Benjamin Briggs just weeks ago. Devoe and his men climbed aboard. The first thing they noticed was the silence, the creaking of the ship's timbers, the flapping of loose rigging, the sound of water against the hull, but no voices, no footsteps, no sign of life. They called out, "Hello, anyone aboard?" No answer. Devoe made his way to the main deck. Several sails were set, but some were torn or in disarray. The rigging was in disorder, not catastrophically, but as if no one had tended to it for days. Some lines were tangled, others hanging loose. The ship's wheel was not lashed. It spun freely, unmanned. The ship's only lifeboat was missing. The davits, the mechanisms used to lower a lifeboat, hung empty. Devoe descended the companionway into the ship's interior. The captain's cabin was at the stern. The door was open. Inside, the scene was strange. The bed was unmade, not slept in, just unmade. A captain's coat hung on a hook. Personal items were scattered about, but not in a way that suggested panic or struggle, more like everyday disarray. Captain Briggs's navigational instruments, his sextant and chronometer, were missing. The ship's papers, including the register and the crew list, were also gone. But other valuables remained. Briggs's watch was hanging on the wall. Sarah's jewelry and personal belongings were in the cabin, untouched. In what had been Sophia's area, there were toys, a child's playthings, left behind. DeVoe moved to the galley. Cooking equipment was neatly stowed. There was no food prepared or in the process of being prepared, but there were ample provisions in the stores, barrels of food, barrels of fresh water, enough for 6 months at sea. He examined the cargo hold. The main hatch was sealed, battened down properly. DeVoe and his men removed the hatch cover and looked inside. The hold contained the 1,701 barrels of alcohol. They appeared to be intact, though 9 of the barrels were empty or had lost their contents. This was not unusual. Some leakage or breakage during a rough voyage was expected. But the cargo was largely undisturbed. There was no sign that anyone had been stealing or tampering with it. There was water in the hold, about 3.5 feet of it, sloshing back and forth with the ship's movement. This amount of water in the bilge was not immediately dangerous. The ship was in no risk of sinking. One of the pumps had been disassembled, possibly for cleaning or repair, but this too was not alarming. DeVoe made a thorough search of the entire ship, the crew's quarters, the storage areas, every possible hiding place. Nothing. No bodies, no blood, no sign of violence or struggle, no indication of what had happened. The ship was simply empty. DeVoe returned to the deck and looked around one more time. The Mary Celeste was seaworthy. Her hull was sound. Her cargo was intact. She had food, water, and supplies. But every single person who had been aboard was gone. DeVoe climbed back down to the boat and returned to the DEI Gresha to report to Captain Morehouse. Morehouse listened to the report with growing disbelief. He knew Benjamin Briggs. He knew Briggs was a careful, experienced captain. He knew Briggs had his wife and daughter aboard. What could possibly have made them abandon a perfectly sound ship? Morehouse had to make a decision. Under maritime salvage law, a ship found abandoned at sea could be claimed as salvage. The salvagers, in this case the crew of the DEI Gracia, would be entitled to a substantial reward, potentially a significant portion of the combined value of the ship and cargo. But first, the ship had to be brought to port and adjudicated by a court. Morehouse decided to split his crew. He would send 3 men, DeVoe, Augustus Anderson, and a sailor named Charles Lund, to sail the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, about 600 nautical miles away. Meanwhile, Morehouse and the rest of the DEI Gracia's crew would continue on their own ship to the same destination. It was risky. Splitting a crew at sea always carried danger, but the potential reward was substantial, and the Mary Celeste was seaworthy enough to make the journey. DeVoe and his 2 companions climbed aboard the ghost ship. They pumped out some of the water in the hold. They repaired the worst of the rigging. They set the sails properly. And on December 4th, 1872, the Mary Celeste began sailing again, guided by 3 men who had not been her crew, heading toward Gibraltar and toward a mystery that would never be fully solved. Part 5. The Investigation. Both ships arrived in Gibraltar on December 13th, 1872, 9 days after the discovery of the Mary Celeste. Their arrival caused an immediate sensation. Word spread quickly through the port. A ship had been found abandoned at sea, all her crew missing, no clear explanation. Under British maritime law, since Gibraltar was a British territory, the case would be handled by the Vice Admiralty Court. A salvage hearing would be conducted to determine what had happened and whether the crew of the DEI Gracia were entitled to a salvage reward. The Attorney General of Gibraltar, Frederick Solly Flood, was appointed to conduct the investigation. Flood was known for being thorough, skeptical, and not easily convinced. From the moment he examined the Mary Celeste, Flood suspected foul play. He ordered a detailed inspection of the ship. Marine surveyors examined every inch of the vessel, documenting everything they found. The findings: the ship's hull was sound, no significant damage, no evidence of collision or grounding. The rigging was in disorder, but this could be explained by the ship sailing unmanned for days. There was water in the hold, but not enough to cause concern about sinking. One of the pumps had been disassembled, but this suggested routine maintenance, not an emergency. The cargo of alcohol was largely intact. 9 barrels were empty or leaking, but this could happen during rough weather. The main hatch had been sealed when DeVoe's crew found it. But there were some details that troubled the investigators. On the ship's bow, there were cuts in the wood, marks that looked like they'd been made deliberately. Were these evidence of an attack, or just normal wear and tear? On the deck railing, there were stains, reddish-brown stains that might have been blood. In Captain Briggs's cabin, there was a sword, not unusual. Many captains kept weapons aboard, but this sword appeared to have stains on it as well. Flood became convinced that something violent had occurred. He theorized that perhaps the crew had gotten drunk on the alcohol cargo, murdered Captain Briggs and his family in a drunken frenzy, and then fled in the lifeboat. Or perhaps the crew of the DEI Gracia had been involved. Perhaps Morehouse and his men had encountered the Mary Celeste, murdered everyone aboard, and then concocted a story about finding the ship abandoned in order to claim the salvage reward. These were serious accusations. Flood ordered chemical tests on the stains. The results came back, not blood. The stains on the deck and on the sword were rust mixed with seawater and other materials, not human blood. Flood's theories began to collapse, but he remained suspicious. The salvage hearing continued for 3 months, from December 1872 through March 1873. Witness after witness testified. Members of the DEI Gracia crew, marine surveyors, expert witnesses. Captain David Morehouse testified about finding the ship and making the decision to salvage it. He explained his relationship with Captain Briggs. They were acquaintances, not close friends. But he had dined with the Briggs family shortly before the Mary Celeste sailed. Oliver DeVoe testified in detail about boarding the ship and what he found. He described the scene carefully: the unmade bed, the missing lifeboat, the intact cargo, the navigational instruments gone, but valuables left behind. No evidence of foul play was found, no blood, no signs of violence, no indication that anyone had been murdered. The court eventually concluded that there was no proof of any crime. Whatever had happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste, it did not appear to be the result of murder or piracy. But the court remained troubled by the circumstances. The case was unusual. The complete disappearance of 10 people from a seaworthy ship was unprecedented. In the end, the DEI Gracia's crew was awarded a salvage payment, but it was much smaller than what they might have expected. They received about $8,300, only about 1/5 of the ship and cargo's total value. The low award reflected the court's lingering suspicions. Even though no evidence of wrongdoing was found, there was an unspoken sense that something wasn't quite right about the whole affair. The Mary Celeste herself was returned to James Winchester and the other owners. She was repaired and returned to service. But she would never shake the reputation of being a cursed ship, a ghost ship. And the question remained, what happened to Benjamin Briggs, Sarah Briggs, Sophia Briggs, and the 7 crew members? Where did they go? Why did they leave a perfectly seaworthy ship? And what was their fate? Part 6. The theories begin. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, newspapers around the world picked up the story. The mystery of the Mary Celeste captured public imagination. In an era before radio, before instant communication, when the ocean was still a vast and mysterious place, the idea of a ship sailing empty across the Atlantic was both fascinating and terrifying. Speculation began immediately. Theory 1. Piracy. The most obvious explanation seemed to be piracy. Perhaps the Mary Celeste had been boarded by pirates, the crew murdered or kidnapped, and the ship left adrift. But this theory had problems. Why would pirates leave the cargo? The alcohol alone was worth $37,000. Sarah Briggs's jewelry and other valuables were untouched. If pirates had attacked, they would have taken everything of value. And where was the evidence of a fight? Experienced sailors don't surrender without resistance. There should have been signs of a struggle. Damage to the ship, blood, weapons. The absence of any such evidence made piracy seem unlikely. Theory 2. Mutiny. Perhaps the crew had mutinied against Captain Briggs, murdered him and his family, and fled in the lifeboat. But again, the theory had problems. Captain Briggs was known as a fair and even-tempered commander. The crew had been carefully chosen. They were described as peaceable and first-class sailors. There were no reports of any discord before the voyage. And why would mutineers leave behind a valuable ship and cargo? If they'd successfully taken control, they could have sailed the Mary Celeste to a port and sold the cargo. Sarah Briggs had written in her last letter that the crew seemed to be very good men, and that she had nothing to fear from them. These don't sound like the words of someone sensing trouble. Theory 3. Insurance fraud. Some suggested that Captain Briggs himself might have been involved in a scheme to defraud the insurance companies. Perhaps he arranged for the ship to be abandoned so that a Confederate could claim salvage, and everyone would split the money. This theory also fell apart under scrutiny. Briggs had invested his own money, $2,500, in the ship. He owned 4 shares. He had every financial reason to want the voyage to succeed. More importantly, he had brought his wife and 2-year-old daughter on the voyage. Would a man involve his family in such a dangerous scheme? And if it was fraud, what happened to the 10 people who left the ship? Where did they go? No one matching their descriptions ever appeared anywhere. Theory 4. Explosion or fire. Perhaps there had been an explosion aboard the ship. Maybe the alcohol cargo had caught fire or given off fumes that exploded. The crew, fearing for their lives, abandoned ship in the lifeboat. This seemed more plausible. It would explain the sudden departure. It would explain why the navigational instruments were taken. The crew planned to return if the danger passed. But there was no evidence of fire or explosion on the ship. No scorching, no smoke damage, no smell of burned materials. The cargo of alcohol was still there, largely intact. The main hatch had been sealed when the ship was found. If the crew feared an alcohol explosion, they would have opened the hatch to vent the fumes, not sealed it shut. Theory 5. Attack by sea creature. In an era when the ocean was still full of mystery, some suggested that a sea monster might have attacked the ship. A giant squid, perhaps, reaching up from the depths and snatching people off the deck. This was more fantasy than theory. There was no evidence of such an attack, and it didn't explain why everyone would have been on deck simultaneously, or why the lifeboat would be missing. But the fact that people seriously proposed this theory shows how baffling the case was. In the absence of rational explanations, imagination filled the void. Theory 6. Waterspout. A waterspout is a tornado-like column of water that can form over the ocean. Some suggested that a waterspout might have struck the Mary Celeste, terrifying the crew into abandoning ship. This would explain a sudden, panic-driven departure. Waterspouts can appear quickly and are frightening to witness. But waterspouts typically cause damage, torn sails, wrecked rigging, water pouring onto the deck. The Mary Celeste showed no such damage. And if the crew fled due to a waterspout, why didn't they return once the danger passed? The ship was still seaworthy. The theories multiplied, but none of them quite fit all the facts. And then, in 1884, something happened that would change the Mary Celeste story forever. Part 7. The fiction that became fact. In 1884, 12 years after the Mary Celeste was found, a young Scottish doctor and aspiring writer named Arthur Conan Doyle published a short story. The story was titled J. Habakkuk Jepson's Statement. Doyle, who would later become famous for creating Sherlock Holmes, was fascinated by the Mary Celeste case. He decided to write a fictionalized account of what might have happened. In his story, he made several changes to the facts. He called the ship the Mary Celeste, with an I instead of a I, a misspelling that would become more famous than the correct name. He changed details about the ship's condition and cargo. He invented a dramatic backstory involving a vengeful African man who had been enslaved, who boards the ship disguised as a passenger, and who eventually leads an uprising that results in the crew being murdered and thrown overboard. The story ended with the sole survivor escaping to tell the tale. It was pure fiction. Doyle never claimed it was real. He wrote it as entertainment, as a mystery story. But the story was published in a respected magazine, Cornhill Magazine, without any clear indication that it was fiction. Many readers assumed it was a factual account. The story became enormously popular. It was reprinted in newspapers around the world. People who had never heard of the Mary Celeste suddenly knew about the Mary Celeste and the facts of the case, many of which were Doyle's inventions. Even after it was revealed that the story was fiction, the details Doyle had invented became part of the legend. To this day, you'll find articles and books that cite facts that came from Doyle's story, not from the actual historical record. The Mary Celeste had become the Mary Celeste in popular consciousness, and the real mystery, already strange enough, had been obscured by layers of fiction and sensationalism. Over the decades that followed, the story was retold countless times. Each retelling added new details, new theories, new embellishments. By the early 20th century, the Mary Celeste had become one of the most famous maritime mysteries in history, but also one of the most distorted by myth and legend. Part 8. The ship's final fate. While the mystery of what happened to the crew was never solved, the Mary Celeste herself had a final chapter. After the salvage hearing in Gibraltar, the ship was returned to her owners and put back into service. But the ship's reputation was irreparably damaged. She was known as a ghost ship, a cursed vessel. Sailors didn't want to serve on her. Finding crews was difficult. The ship passed through several owners over the next dozen years. Each owner struggled to make a profit with her. The curse, whether real or simply a matter of superstition affecting hiring and insurance rates, seemed to follow her. By 1885, the Mary Celeste was in poor condition. She'd been at sea for over 20 years, counting her time as the Amazon. She needed extensive repairs that her current owners didn't want to pay for. Her last captain was a man named Gilman C. Parker. Parker hatched a scheme. He would deliberately wreck the Mary Celeste and file a fraudulent insurance claim, inflating the value of the ship and cargo. On January 3, 1885, Parker loaded the ship with a cargo of cheap, nearly worthless goods, rubber boots, cat food, cutlery, but insured it as if it were expensive merchandise. He sailed the Mary Celeste toward Haiti. On January 3rd, he deliberately ran the ship aground on the Rochelet Reef off the coast of Haiti. His plan was for the ship to break apart and sink, destroying all evidence of the worthless cargo. He would then claim the insurance money. But the Mary Celeste refused to sink. The ship hung up on the coral reef, damaged but visible. When insurance investigators came to examine the wreck, they quickly discovered Parker's fraud. The valuable cargo was revealed to be junk. Parker and his co-conspirators were charged with fraud, but the case never went to trial. Parker died before the proceedings could begin, some say from stress and shame, others suggest yellow fever. His co-conspirators avoided significant punishment. The Mary Celeste was left where she'd been wrecked, on the Rochelet Reef. Over time, the Atlantic and the Caribbean sun did their work. The ship broke apart, the timbers rotted, the sea reclaimed what was left. Today, nothing remains of the Mary Celeste, except fragments of debris on the reef visible at low tide. The ship that had survived storms, collisions, and decades at sea was finally destroyed, not by the ocean's fury, but by human greed. It was an ignominious end for a vessel that had become legendary, but perhaps there's something fitting about it. The Mary Celeste had always been marked by bad luck, by tragedy, by mystery. Even her destruction was tainted with crime and fraud. The ship was gone, but the mystery of what happened to her crew in December 1872 remained unsolved, and remains unsolved to this day. Part 9. Modern Analysis. Over the 150 years since the Mary Celeste was found abandoned, countless investigators, historians, and researchers have examined the case with modern analytical tools and perspectives. Let's look at what contemporary analysis tells us. The weather records. Meteorologists have examined historical weather data from late November and early December 1872. They've analyzed barometric pressure readings, wind patterns, and storm reports from ships in the area. What they've found: there was rough weather in the North Atlantic during the Mary Celeste's voyage, particularly in the third week of November, but nothing extraordinary, nothing that would explain a sudden panic-driven abandonment of the ship. However, weather records from 1872 are incomplete. Localized squalls or waterspouts wouldn't necessarily have been recorded unless a ship happened to witness them. So the weather analysis is inconclusive. There might have been a sudden meteorological event, but we can't prove it. The alcohol cargo. Modern chemists have analyzed the type of alcohol that was in the Mary Celeste's cargo. It was denatured industrial alcohol, ethanol mixed with methanol and other chemicals to make it undrinkable and non-taxable. This type of alcohol has a relatively low boiling point. In warm conditions, or if exposed to heat, it can produce vapors. One theory that has gained traction among modern researchers is the alcohol vapor theory. The ship had been sailing through rough weather. The cargo would have been jostled. possibly causing some of the barrels to leak or become unsealed. When the weather improved and the sun came out, the temperature in the hold would have risen. This could have caused the alcohol to produce vapors, invisible, but with a distinctive smell. If Captain Briggs opened the main hatch to check on the cargo and was hit with a strong smell of alcohol vapor, he might have feared that an explosion was imminent. Alcohol vapors are indeed explosive in certain concentrations. While the actual risk might have been lower than Briggs feared, his concern would have been understandable. In 2006, a team of researchers conducted an experiment. They built a replica of the Mary Celeste's hold and cargo using the same type of barrels and similar alcohol. They simulated the conditions the ship would have experienced. They found that under certain circumstances, a vapor explosion could occur. Not a destructive blast, but a rapid expansion of gas that would blow the main hatch open and produce a visible flash or gout of flame. This could explain several aspects of the mystery. Why the crew would have abandoned ship in apparent haste. Why the main hatch was found unsealed. Briggs might have opened it to check on the cargo after hearing or seeing the vapor ignition. Why 9 of the barrels were later found empty or damaged. They might have been the source of the vapor. Why there was no actual fire damage to the ship. Vapor ignitions burn hot but brief. The scenario would work like this. Captain Briggs opens the hatch. He smells alcohol vapors. Suddenly, there's a whoosh of flame as the vapors ignite. Not an explosion that damages the ship, but enough to terrify anyone standing nearby. Briggs, fearing a larger explosion might follow, makes a snap decision. Evacuate the ship immediately. He orders everyone into the lifeboat. He grabs the ship's navigational instruments and papers. He plans to return once he's certain the danger is past. The crew lowers the lifeboat. They row a safe distance away, perhaps trailing behind the ship on a rope to keep pace with its drift. They wait. Hours pass. No explosion comes. The ship continues to sail, driven by the wind. But something goes wrong with the lifeboat. The rope breaks, or the weather worsens, or the lifeboat starts taking on water. And the Mary Celeste, still under sail, continues to move away from them. They can't catch up. They're left behind, stranded in the Atlantic with no ship. They would have died within hours or days. Exposure, dehydration, eventually drowning when the lifeboat capsized or filled with water. This theory fits many of the facts. It explains the sudden abandonment, the missing navigational instruments, the missing lifeboat. But it's still just a theory. We can't prove it's what happened. The timeline problem. One challenge for all theories is the timeline. The last entry in the ship's log was November 25th, noting that the ship was near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. But when the DEI Gracia found the Mary Celeste on December 4th, the ship was about 400 miles east of the Azores, considerably past where it should have been if it had been abandoned on November 25th. This suggests one of two possibilities. The ship was abandoned later than November 25th, but no one made any more log entries during those additional days. The ship was indeed abandoned on or shortly after November 25th and drifted unmanned for over a week, covering those 400 miles under whatever sails remained set. The second option seems more likely. An unmanned ship can cover significant distances if the wind is favorable and some sails remain set. But it's troubling that there are no log entries after November 25th. If the crew continued sailing for several more days, why didn't Captain Briggs continue his meticulous record keeping? Unless something changed on November 25th that made him stop recording entries. Something that distracted him, something that began the sequence of events that led to abandonment. The lifeboat theory. All theories must account for the missing lifeboat. This is the one piece of evidence that tells us the crew deliberately left the ship. The lifeboat was gone. The davits that held it were empty. This wasn't a case of people being washed overboard or falling into the sea. They made a conscious decision to lower the lifeboat and get into it. But here's a crucial detail that's often overlooked. The Mary Celeste's lifeboat was small, very small. Contemporary accounts describe it as a yawl, a small boat designed to carry perhaps 4 or 5 people in calm conditions. 10 people in a small yawl in Atlantic waters would have been extremely dangerous. Overloaded, unstable, vulnerable to swamping. Even if they successfully launched the lifeboat, their chances of survival would have been minimal unless they were immediately rescued by a passing ship. And no passing ship reported rescuing anyone matching the description of the Mary Celeste's crew. So if they did abandon ship and take to the lifeboat, they almost certainly died at sea shortly thereafter. The pump theory. Remember that one of the ship's pumps had been disassembled when DeVoe's crew found the ship. Some researchers have suggested this might be significant. Perhaps the crew thought the ship was taking on water faster than it actually was. Perhaps they panicked, believing the ship was sinking, and abandoned her prematurely. This would explain a hasty departure, but it doesn't explain why Captain Briggs, an experienced seaman, would misjudge the danger so badly. There was water in the hold when the ship was found, but not enough to threaten the ship. An experienced captain would have known the difference between normal bilge water and a dangerous leak. Unless the crew's perception was somehow distorted, unless they were in a state of panic or confusion that prevented rational assessment. The seaquake theory. A more recent theory proposes that an underwater seismic event, a seaquake, might have occurred near the ship. Seaquakes can produce strange effects, sudden violent movements of the ship, loud noises like explosions, strange vibrations, water erupting around the vessel. To a crew unfamiliar with such phenomena, a seaquake might seem like the ship was breaking apart or about to explode. This could have prompted an evacuation. The problem with this theory is that we have no records of seismic activity in that area at that time. But then again, seismic monitoring in 1872 was virtually non-existent, especially at sea. It's possible, but unprovable. Part 10. The human element. All these theories, the vapor explosion, the seaquake, the pump malfunction, focus on physical explanations, mechanical causes, things we can analyze and test. But there's another dimension to consider, the human element, the psychology of the people involved. Captain Benjamin Briggs was experienced, yes, but he had his wife and 2-year-old daughter aboard. This changed everything. A captain alone with his crew might take certain calculated risks. He might ride out a storm, might stay aboard a damaged ship to save the cargo, might make decisions based purely on seamanship and maritime law. But a father with his child aboard thinks differently. His priority isn't the cargo or the ship, it's keeping his family safe. If Briggs perceived any threat to Sarah and Sophia, real or imagined, his response would have been immediate and absolute. Get them off the ship, get them to safety, nothing else matters. This might explain an apparently overreaction to a situation that, in hindsight, didn't warrant abandoning ship. If Briggs saw or smelled something that made him fear an explosion, even if the actual risk was minimal, he wouldn't have waited to verify the danger. He would have evacuated his family immediately. And once the decision was made, the crew would have followed. They trusted their captain. If he said, "Abandon ship," they abandoned ship. Sarah Briggs's perspective is also worth considering. She was not a sailor. She was a pastor's daughter, educated and intelligent, but without maritime experience. The rough voyage, the isolation, the strangeness of life at sea, all of this would have been stressful. If something frightening occurred, a strange noise, a smell, a sudden movement of the ship, her reaction might have been more fearful than a sailor's would have been. And her fear might have influenced her husband's decisions. 2-year-old Sophia would have picked up on her parents' emotions. If they were frightened, she would have been frightened. A crying child in a crisis makes everything more difficult, clouds judgment, creates urgency. So perhaps the real explanation for the Mary Celeste mystery isn't a single catastrophic event, but a cascade of smaller factors. Rough weather stressing everyone aboard, alcohol vapors creating a frightening smell, a sudden noise or movement, a hatch blowing open, a barrel shifting, anything unexpected, Sarah's fear, Sophia crying, Briggs making a split-second decision to evacuate his family. The crew following orders, getting into a too small lifeboat, rowing away from the ship. And then, the rope breaking, or not being attached at all. The wind carrying the Mary Celeste away faster than the oarsmen could follow. Watching the ship sail away, realizing too late that they'd made a terrible mistake. Hours in a small boat. The Atlantic is cold in December. Hypothermia setting in, waves growing larger as evening approaches, and finally the boat capsizing or filling with water. 10 people, including a young woman and a 2-year-old child, sinking into the dark water. No rescue, no witnesses, no bodies ever found, because the Atlantic is vast and currents carry things far away. Just 10 people gone, erased from history except for the empty ship they left behind. Is this what happened? We can't know, but it's consistent with human psychology, with the facts we have. with the sad reality that the ocean is unforgiving of mistakes. Part 11. The alternative theories. Of course, not everyone is satisfied with rational explanations. The Mary Celeste has inspired more exotic theories over the years. Let's examine some of them, not because they're likely true, but because they're part of the legend. Alien abduction. Yes, people have seriously proposed this. The crew was taken by extraterrestrials who left the ship intact as evidence of their visit. This requires no serious rebuttal. It's fantasy, not investigation. Time anomaly. Some have suggested the ship passed through some kind of temporal distortion, a time slip, that transported the crew to another time or dimension while leaving the ship behind. Again, this is fiction, not history. It makes a good plot for a science fiction story, but has no basis in evidence. Attack by giant squid. This one actually has some maritime precedent. There are documented cases of giant squid attacking small boats. Sailors throughout history have reported encounters with enormous cephalopods. But a squid attack wouldn't explain why the lifeboat was missing. It wouldn't explain why the crew would have deliberately launched the boat and left the ship. Unless the squid was attacking the ship itself, terrifying the crew into fleeing. It's colorful, but there's no evidence to support it. Ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. When consumed, it can cause hallucinations, paranoia, and irrational behavior. Some have suggested that the crew might have eaten ergot-contaminated bread, causing them to hallucinate and abandon ship in a delusional state. The problem with this theory, ergot poisoning would have affected everyone gradually and would have produced obvious symptoms, convulsions, strange behavior, that should have been noted before the final abandonment. And Captain Briggs, as an experienced captain, would have recognized the symptoms. He wouldn't have abandoned ship due to his crew's delusions. He would have tried to treat them. Underwater volcanic activity. Related to the seaquake theory, some have proposed that underwater volcanic activity might have created gas bubbles that rose to the surface, causing the water around the ship to froth and boil. This would have been terrifying to witness, and might have made the crew think the ship was in immediate danger. But again, there's no record of volcanic activity in that area at that time. Magnetic anomaly. Some have suggested that a magnetic disturbance might have affected the ship's compass and instruments, causing the crew to become disoriented and abandon ship. But the navigational instruments were taken with the crew when they left. If the instruments were malfunctioning, why take them? And compass malfunction wouldn't explain a panic evacuation. It would cause navigational problems, not fear for the ship's integrity. None of these alternative theories fit the evidence as well as the simpler explanations. A perceived threat, vapor explosion, seaquake or similar, a hasty evacuation, and a tragic outcome when the crew couldn't get back to the ship. Sometimes the simplest explanation really is the most likely. Part 12. The survivors who never spoke. One of the most haunting aspects of the Mary Celeste mystery is that we'll never hear from the people who were there. If even one person had survived, if the lifeboat had been found, if someone had washed ashore somewhere, if there had been a witness, we would know what happened. But there were no survivors, no witnesses, no messages in bottles, no dying confession washed up on a beach. 10 people vanished completely. Let's remember who they were. Captain Benjamin Briggs, 37 years old. A man of faith, a careful captain, a loving husband and father. He had planned to return to his son Arthur in the spring. He had invested his savings in the Mary Celeste. He had everything to live for. Sarah Elizabeth Cobb Briggs, 31 years old, the daughter of a minister, educated and refined. She had written optimistically about the crew, about the voyage. She had been looking forward to the adventure. Sophia Matilda Briggs, 2 years old, a child who barely had a chance to live, who played with her toys in the cabin, who would never grow up, never go to school, never have her own children. 7-year-old Arthur Briggs would wait for his parents and sister to return. When they didn't, when the news came that they'd vanished at sea, how did he process that loss? How do you explain to a child that his entire family disappeared? Arthur would live until 1932, 60 years after the Mary Celeste. He never learned what happened to his family. He grew up with only absence and mystery. Albert G. Richardson, 28 years old, the first mate, married to Frances, Fanny, his dear wife, as he wrote on the slate. She was waiting for him to return. She would wait forever. Andrew Gilling, the second mate, about 25 years old, his life ahead of him, gone. Edward William Head, 23 years old, newly married, the steward and cook, someone's son, someone's husband, vanished. Volkert Lorenzen and Boz Lorenzen, brothers from the Frisian Islands, 29 and 23 years old. They'd gone to sea together, perhaps hoping to make their fortunes. They died together, somewhere in the Atlantic. Arian Martins, 35 years old, described as a first-class sailor, experienced, competent. It didn't save him. Gottlieb Gutschall, 23 years old, young, strong, with his whole life before him. 10 people, 10 names, 10 lives cut short. They have no graves, no memorials except the ship that outlived them and the mystery that consumed them. The ocean took them and never gave them back. Part 13. The Legacy. The Mary Celeste has become more than just a maritime mystery. It's become part of our cultural vocabulary. When we say something is a Mary Celeste moment or a ghost ship situation, we mean something abandoned mysteriously, something that should have people but doesn't. The story has been adapted countless times in literature. Dozens of novels and short stories have used the Mary Celeste as inspiration or setting, from adventure stories to horror tales to science fiction. In film and television, the mystery has been featured in documentaries, dramatizations, and fictional adaptations. Some stay close to the facts. Others use the ship as a jumping-off point for wild speculation. In music, Songs have been written about the ghost ship and her lost crew. In art, paintings and illustrations have captured the eerie scene of the empty ship drifting on the ocean. The Mary Celeste has inspired everything from serious historical investigation to pulp fiction to children's mystery books. Why does this story endure? Perhaps because it taps into something primal, our fear of the unknown, our unease about places that should have people but don't, our awareness that the ocean is vast and indifferent and can erase human lives without effort. The Mary Celeste reminds us that even in the modern world, even with all our technology and knowledge, there are still mysteries we cannot solve. She reminds us that the ocean keeps its secrets, and she stands as a monument to 10 people who left a ship one December day in 1872 and were never seen again. Part 14. The Facts We Know. Let's strip away all the theories, all the speculation, all the myth and legend that have accumulated around the Mary Celeste. What do we actually know for certain? Facts. The Mary Celeste sailed from New York on November 7, 1872, bound for Genoa, Italy, with a cargo of industrial alcohol. Aboard were Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their daughter Sophia, aged 2, and 7 crew members, 10 people total. The last entry in the ship's log was November 25, 1872, noting the ship's position near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. On December 4, 1872, the DEI Grazia found the Mary Celeste sailing unmanned approximately 400 miles east of the Azores. The ship was seaworthy, the hull was intact, the cargo was largely undamaged. The ship's only lifeboat was missing. Captain Briggs's navigational instruments and the ship's papers were missing. Personal valuables, including Sarah Briggs's jewelry, were left behind. There was no evidence of violence, fire, or major damage to the ship. A salvage hearing concluded there was no evidence of foul play. No trace of the 10 missing people was ever found. No bodies, no wreckage of the lifeboat, no evidence of their fate. What we don't know: when exactly the crew abandoned ship, why they abandoned a seaworthy vessel, what they perceived as a threat, whether they died quickly or survived for days in the lifeboat, where their bodies ended up. These unknowns are what keep the mystery alive. We have enough information to eliminate some theories: piracy, mutiny, insurance fraud, but we don't have enough information to definitively prove what actually happened. The most likely explanation remains some version of the vapor explosion or perceived emergency theory. Captain Briggs believed the ship was in immediate danger, ordered an evacuation. The crew took to the lifeboat, and something prevented them from returning to the ship. But most likely is not the same as proven. The truth is, we don't know, we can't know. Too much time has passed. The only witnesses are long dead, and they left no testimony behind. Part 15. The Lessons of the Mary Celeste. What can we learn from the Mary Celeste? On one level, the lessons are about maritime safety. Never abandon a ship unless you're absolutely certain it's sinking. More people have died in lifeboats than would have survived by staying with a damaged but floating vessel. Don't let fear override training and experience. A moment of panic can lead to fatal decisions. Keep thorough records. The gaps in the Mary Celeste's log after November 25th leave us with uncertainty about the final days aboard. But on a deeper level, the Mary Celeste teaches us about mystery itself. We live in an age that demands answers. We expect that every question can be answered, every mystery solved, every problem resolved with enough investigation and technology. The Mary Celeste reminds us that this isn't always true. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, despite all our analysis and investigation, the truth remains elusive. Sometimes we have to live with uncertainty, with questions that have no answers, with mysteries that will never be solved. And perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. Perhaps mystery reminds us of our limitations. Perhaps it keeps us humble. Perhaps it adds a necessary element of wonder to a world that often seems too thoroughly explained and documented. The Mary Celeste stands as a monument to the unknown, to the things we cannot explain, to the ocean's vast indifference to human understanding. And maybe that's its greatest legacy. Part 16. The Final Voyage. I want to take you on one more journey, not a physical journey, but an imaginative one. Let's place ourselves aboard the Mary Celeste in late November 1872. Let's try to inhabit that moment when everything changed. It's November 25th, maybe November 26th. The ship has been at sea for nearly 3 weeks. The rough weather of the early voyage has improved. The sun is out. The seas are calmer. Captain Briggs is in his cabin, working on his charts. Sarah is nearby, perhaps reading or mending clothes. Little Sophia is playing with her toys. On deck, the crew goes about their routine, checking the rigging, adjusting the sails. Albert Richardson, the first mate, takes a navigational reading and makes a note on the slate. Fanny, my dear wife. Everything is normal, routine, just another day at sea. And then something happens. Maybe it's a smell, the distinctive odor of alcohol vapors drifting up from the hold. Maybe it's a sound, a strange rumbling from below, a hatch blowing open, barrels shifting. Maybe it's something visual, a wisp of vapor, a flash of flame as gases ignite in the hold. Whatever it is, it's sudden enough and frightening enough that Captain Briggs makes an instant decision. Abandon ship. The crew responds immediately. These are trained sailors. They know how to move in an emergency. The lifeboat is lowered. Sarah grabs Sophia. Briggs grabs his sextant and chronometer. He'll need these if they're going to navigate back to the ship later, or if they need to reach land. The crew loads some food and water into the lifeboat if there's time. Or maybe there isn't time. Maybe they just jump in and push off. They row away from the Mary Celeste, a safe distance, far enough that if the ship explodes, they won't be caught in the blast. They wait. The ship continues to sail, driven by the wind. The crew rows to keep pace. Maybe they've tied a rope to the ship. Maybe they haven't. Hours pass. The sun moves across the sky. The feared explosion doesn't come. Briggs realizes he may have overreacted. The danger, if there ever was one, has passed. They need to get back to the ship. But the Mary Celeste is moving. The wind is carrying her away. The lifeboat is small and overloaded. Rowing against the wind and current with 10 people aboard is nearly impossible. They can't catch the ship. They're falling behind. And then maybe the rope breaks, or the weather worsens, or a wave swamps the lifeboat. Sarah holds Sophia close. The child is crying. Everyone is wet, cold, frightened. Briggs tries to remain calm, tries to calculate their position, tries to figure out what to do. But there's nothing to do. They're in a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic with no ship, no rescue coming, no hope. The Mary Celeste sails away, growing smaller on the horizon. Eventually she disappears from view. The lifeboat drifts. Maybe it lasts hours, maybe days, but ultimately the outcome is the same. The cold Atlantic water, the exhaustion, the hypothermia setting in. One by one they slip away. Or maybe the boat capsizes and they all go at once. Sarah, holding Sophia to the very end. The brothers Volkert and Boz side by side. Captain Briggs still clutching his sextant, still trying to calculate a position that no longer matters. They sink beneath the waves, the ocean closes over them, and the Mary Celeste sails on, empty, a ghost ship carrying no one, bearing witness to nothing. Is this what happened? We'll never know, but it fits the facts, and it's heartbreaking in its simplicity. A series of understandable decisions, each one reasonable in the moment, that led to tragedy. Part 17. Epilogue. The ship that outlived her crew. The waves still roll across the Atlantic. The wind still fills empty sails and carries ships across the vast ocean. And somewhere in the depths or scattered on distant shores, 10 people rest. Benjamin Briggs, 37 years old. The careful captain who made one decision he couldn't take back. Sarah Briggs, 31 years old. The minister's daughter who loved adventure and trusted her husband's judgment. Sophia Briggs, 2 years old. A child who never had the chance to grow up, whose toys remained in the cabin for strangers to find. Albert Richardson, 28 years old, who wrote his wife's name on a slate and thought he'd see her again. Andrew Gilling, Edward William Head, Volkert Lorenzen, Boz Lorenzen, Arian Martins, Gottlieb Gutschall, 7 sailors who signed on for what should have been a routine voyage. They left behind a ship that would become legend, a mystery that would outlast everyone who investigated it, a story that would be told and retold for over a century. The Mary Celeste herself sailed on, manned by salvage crews, then by new owners, carrying cargo and history in equal measure. She sailed for 13 more years after her crew vanished, always marked by the reputation of being a ghost ship, always struggling under the weight of her legend. And when she finally met her end on a Haitian reef in 1885, destroyed by greed and fraud, it seemed almost fitting, as if the ship, like her lost crew, had been cursed from the beginning, Today you can dive on the reef where the Mary Celeste broke apart. You can touch timbers that once carried 10 souls across the ocean. You can swim through the wreckage of history. But you won't find answers there. Just fragments, just remnants. Just the physical pieces of a story whose truth was lost at sea. The Mary Celeste endures not as a ship, the ship is gone, but as a mystery, as a question without an answer, as a reminder that despite all our knowledge, all our investigation, all our forensic tools and historical analysis, some things remain forever beyond our grasp. 10 people boarded a ship in New York in November 1872. 10 people left that ship somewhere in the Atlantic, and the sea never gave them back. This is the story of the Mary Celeste. This is the mystery of the ghost ship. This is what happens when the known world ends and the ocean begins. Sleep if you can.